Hello everybody, how y'all doing? We're going to talk about the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Now, before I get into it, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe and tell your friends about the show. Thank you. Okay, last episode I told you about one of the most infamous people in the history of New Mexico and the entire Southwest. That was Don Juan de Onate. He was the first governor of New Mexico, and he was responsible for what is known as the Acoma Massacre. And if you want to know more about that, like I said, I talked about that in the previous episode. Now, in order to understand the root causes of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, we need to discuss how the Spanish traditionally colonized lands that they encountered. Remember, the motto of the early Spanish colonizers was God, glory, and gold. Expeditions were carried out by soldiers who sought fame by conquest and gold to help finance Spain and the expansion of the Spanish Empire. The other word involved is God, because Spain was a Catholic country and it was the official policy of the government to spread Catholicism around the world to people that many considered to be pagans and savages. They were supposed to civilize them by converting them to the church. Now, the Spanish tried to bring the indigenous people to the church and also assimilate them into Spanish culture through the establishment of a series of missions. The Spanish missions in New Mexico were primarily established during these 16th and early 17th centuries, beginning soon after the Spanish colonization efforts intensified in the American Southwest. Now, in 1598, Spanish colonist Juan de Onate led an expedition into present-day New Mexico, talked about that last week, and established the first permanent European settlement at San Juan de los Caballeros. Now, that is near present-day Owejan Pueblo. Now, from 1607 to 1610, the Spanish missions began spreading under Franciscan friars who accompanied military and colonial expeditions. The Franciscans focused on converting the Pueblo peoples. In 1610, Santa Fe was founded as the colonial capital of New Mexico, and missions spread to surrounding Pueblo communities. Throughout the 17th century, dozens of missions were established in New Mexico, often directly adjacent to or even within existing Pueblo settlements. That they were near the various Pueblo settlements is an important aspect. The missions were central to the Spanish colonial strategy, combining religious conversion with cultural assimilation. So, what was life like for the Pueblo peoples and the missions? Well, let's put it this way. While in today's world it wouldn't be tolerated by people, well, okay, I take that back. In some nations it was the standard. It was the standard of the times. And in some nations today it would still be tolerated. So what they had? They had religious conversion and cultural suppression, forced conversion. Native peoples, especially the Pueblo Indians, were pressured or compelled to convert to Christianity, actually to Catholicism. Spanish friars saw this as their divine duty. Now, that entailed suppression of native religions. Traditional spiritual practices were outlawed or driven underground. Sacred objects were often destroyed and ceremonies were banned. In place, they had Catholic rituals. Like I said, they were converted to Catholicism, not Protestant Christianity. Daily life became structured around Catholic rites, with attendance at Mass, catechism classes, and religious festivals all became mandatory. Another area was the labor and economy. They called it encomienda system. Native labor was often exploited under a system that allowed Spanish colonists to extract tribute. That's goods or services from the indigenous communities. Agricultural work, well, since the natives worked in the mission fields, tending crops like wheat, corn, beans, and livestock, that was introduced by the Spanish to the area. They were also involved with construction. They built mission churches, adobe dwellings, irrigation systems, and other infrastructure. Now, What were the living conditions like? Well, it was communal living. Missions often had dormitory-style housing for unmarried native converts, separating them from their families and traditional communities. Disease and mortality, contact with Europeans, and we saw this throughout history, American history. A lot of it's kind of been glossed over, but contact with Europeans brought devastating epidemics such as smallpox and measles, killing large numbers of indigenous people. Food and shelter. Well, guess what? Diets changed with Spanish influence. Wheat, beef, and sheep, but food could be scarce. Housing was often cramped and of poorer quality than the traditional Pueblo homes. Remember, they had built multi-story homes, in communities before the Spanish got there. This was not a group of people that we would consider savage. And then there was the cultural exchange. Now, even though they really wanted to force assimilation, many of the native communities blended Catholic and indigenous beliefs, and that created a very unique spiritual tradition. Now, some indigenous people did gain skills in European-style agriculture, carpentry, and blacksmithing, but not because it was something they really wanted to do. They were pretty much forced to. Now, all of this eventually led to resistance and revolt. At first, it was really passive resistance. Many native people secretly practiced their traditional beliefs, avoided full conversion, or simply fled to missions. And then in 1680, what we know as the Pueblo Revolt took place. This was a major uprising led by Popé. He was a Tewa religious leader, and they successfully expelled the Spanish from New Mexico for over a decade. And it was a reaction to the religious oppression, the labor exploitation, and the cultural destruction. It started on August 10th, 1680, and it was led by Popé. And the location was in present-day, obviously, New Mexico, particularly around the Santa Fe and surrounding Pueblo communities. Who were the participants? There were actually several Pueblo groups, including the Hopi, Zuni, Taos, and many others. And again, the causes was religious suppression. Spanish missionaries attempted to eradicate native religions and enforce Catholicism. They destroyed the kivas, which are sacred spaces, and punished any of the religious leaders. And the forced labor, the violence and oppression, there were decades of brutality, executions, and the imposition of Spanish authority. We've seen all these old movies where everybody goes to that looks like Zorro, and they see him around the mission, everybody looks happy. No, they weren't. They were not a happy people. They were they were being oppressed. You can't deny it. So the revolt itself was coordinated across multiple Pueblo communities. The Pueblos killed 400 Spanish, including 21 missionaries. Now, the survivors all fled to El Paso. Now, the Pueblos destroyed missions and Spanish settlements, reclaimed their land, and reintroduced their traditional practices. Okay, the Spanish were expelled for 12 years. And then in 1692, the Spanish returned under Diego de Vargas and reconquered much of the area, but resistance still continued. Now, what happened really was that the revolt forever altered Spanish colonial policy, and it did lead to somewhat more religious and cultural tolerance. Not a whole lot. The Pueblo Revolt is viewed as probably one of the most powerful examples of indigenous resistance that has ever been recorded in the Americas. It disrupted Spanish colonization, and it actually helped to preserve aspects of Pueblo culture. And it, to this day, remains a symbol of native resilience and unity. Okay, that's going to do it for today in this episode, talking about the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. There's lots of great books out there about it, and I suggest you, if you get a chance, check it out. It's part of the hidden history of the American Southwest. It's time we peel back the layers of the onion. Don't forget, tell your friends, subscribe. I'd appreciate it. Talk to y'all later. Have a great one. Peace, y'all.